All right, guys, we're back with another Seeing the World Intricately video. This one's going to be pretty fun because we're going to be talking about Goethe, kind of putting Gebser to the side for a second, which I think should be interesting, if nothing else. And we're going to be talking about Goethean morphology, what it is, political narratives, and how these two ideas sort of converge. I think Goethe was a great thinker. He was a scientist. He was a literary author. He was a borderline philosopher. I would like to see philosophers reference him more. And I think the reason they don't is 'cause I'm not sure he had his own, will as world as will and representation. This sort of classic only philosophical text where it's not combined with literary and other stuff. But Goethe's a brilliant man. He was John David Ebert says he's perhaps the greatest mind in Western civilization ever, and I don't know, even as someone like myself who has a passing familiarity with his ideas, I'm okay, I at least understand why you're saying that. I understand why you would say Michael Jordan is the best basketball player of all time. So that is what we're going to be getting into. So we're going to be talking about how Goethean's a-rational methodology and his a-rational way of perceiving objects and how that transcends the mere 3D traditional rationalist approach. Now, there's sort of a bit of a debate to be had about whether Goethe is being fully irrational or he's just using irrational methods to conclude or intuit rational principles. I'll try to expand that as this goes on, but without further ado, let's get into it. So what is Goethean morphology? So it really is a particular conceptual and phenomenological way of perceiving objects. So Goethe studied living forms by observing how they transformed over time, emphasis on time, on my channel, that's very important. Living things, according to Goethe, are always in a state of perpetual becoming. They never reach the state of become. This is a false binary that rationalists impose on living organisms. Goethe has no time for that. He was a scientist as well. The radical shift Goethe makes is the rationalist, when perceiving a plant or whatever, a tree, what it is it takes the whole and it dissects it into its parts, and then it tries to almost reconstruct the whole through an understanding of the parts. So it starts with the parts and tries to build to the whole. Goethe shifts this. Goethe starts with the whole and moves towards the part. And another radical shift Goethe makes is, instead of rendering the object static, i.e. in a state of become, he puts it in motion, this sort of perpetual becoming. So this is a fundamentally different way of perceiving objects in the world than the traditional rational way. It's very interesting. So what Goethe is trying to do here is, by setting these objects in motion and starting with the whole and then moving to the part, why would you need to move to the part? So Goethe's great idea is that as living organisms, let's say, transform over time, each individual part or organ is a transformation of an underlying formative principle, the if you will. That's what they call it. In the case of plants, it would be called the Planse. So in a way, you can describe this rationally as Goethe, through Goethean morphology and through the noticing of the transformations over time, you intuit the traditional, let's say, Aristotelian telos. That might be a good way of describing it. Or you could think about it as the Platonic idea embedded in the object itself, and each part is an expression or transformation of that underlying formative principle. So there's a little debate to be had here, right? So are we using irrational methods to either intuit or conclude rational ideas or truths? Or are we being fully irrational? Frankly, I'm not entirely sure. I'd probably have to think about it a little more. All I would have to say is it's always good to be clear and to separate these things for the sake of knowledge and, kind of refinement. But if it's an irrational method that allows us to attain, rational truth, so what if it's rational? I understand that we're trying to transcend rationalism, but let's not throw the baby out the bathwater, right? Rationality is an amazing thing so long as it's employed properly. And if we decide that it's employed properly here, great. You know what I mean? So when we look at a plant, say, the traditional rationalist sees the seed, the sprout, the leaf. He sees them, or she sees them, all as independent entities with independent functions. And this is, of course, perfectly in line with the rational way, the mental way of doing things, rendering everything static, isolating them, separating them, and imposing the antithetical framing. So they are individuals. They can exist ontologically as an individual entity onto itself without reference or relation to the other aspects of the environment that constitute it. Great. Goethe says no. Goethe says the seed, the sprout, the leaf, each organ of the plant is a transformation and or a different expression of the underlying formative principle, the planza in this case. Now we'll get into examples. Don't worry. Let's see. Now the key point here, and we'll touch on this more, is that what Goethe is doing here is phenomenological and conceptual. He was a biologist. He was a scientist. So don't think he's detached himself fully and got lost in the clouds. No, his scientific discoveries and his scientific data and knowledge is informing his phenomenological way of doing things. So Goethe, as we'll see later on at the end of this video, is a very integral thinker. He does not separate necessarily philosophy from science. He uses these to inform the other. Let's see. So Goethe believed that modern science, and I think by modern science we could probably fairly say rationalism, kills living organisms by rendering them static and dissecting them to death. You will never, ever, ever get that key underlying formative principle by doing that. You have to put them in motion, and you have to let it come to you rather than you deducing it. Goethe is not focused necessarily on the plant when you look at a particular plant. It's not to say he doesn't respect that, because he does. He's a scientist. He's a biologist. He does respect that. What he's focusing on is the planza, the underlying formative principle that informs that the whole that is the plant. So each organ, each part is an expression or transformation of this underlying formative principle. If you want to call it a telos or an essence, if those are the words that come into your mind, great, so be it. So we're going to use some examples that we stole from John David Ebert. We'll start with the plant. So the planza, the underlying formative principle or process that applies to literally all plants, is as follows: a series of expansions and contractions until a leaf is produced. Every organ of the plant is a transformed leaf. Every part exists to express or transform this underlying formative principle. I want to make this very, very clear that each organ, if you will, of the plant is a transformation of, in this case, a leaf. This is not true in a biological, genetic sense. That's why I made it very clear he's talking about phenomenology and conceptually. He's not talking about genetically, and he would be the first one to admit this. He is a scientist. He understands this. He's not one to mess around with the facts. I am not claiming that the seed and the sprout are biologically or genetically a plant. I'm saying phenomenologically and conceptually, they are transformations or expressions of a plant. A particular part of the flower looks like a transformed, like the stalk. It looks like a transformed leaf. You know, maybe they both develop veins, or maybe it's pretty cool when you think about it. So that's the planza, if you will, for the plant. A series of expansions and contractions until a leaf is produced. Once that leaf is produced, once it's set in motion, it transforms and expresses itself differently, whether it be a sprout or a stalk or whatever it is. So let's take another example. When we look at, let's take a horse, right? So when we look at the horse's legs, as John and Goethe inform us, we notice that they are designed in such a way as to act as a bulwark, or point of resistance against gravity. The hoof is fused with the leg, maximizing the power used to achieve this resistance. The toe, if you will, of the horse's hoof is also curved, allowing the horse to stand on his tiptoe, affording the animal more mobility. It also has a huge respiratory system, the oxidation of which fuels its mobility, as well as a large stomach capable of digesting large quantities of food that, of course, will be transferred into energy. If we look upward, we notice the skull is elongated and enlarged, inside of which are held huge teeth necessary to chew the massive quantities of food to fuel such a large and energetic organism. The beast even possesses a large nasal cavity that connects to its respiratory system, maximizing the animal's mobility. So this is to say that the underlying formative principle is movement. The idea, the essence, the Platonic idea, the telos, the essence, whatever you want to call it, it's movement. Now here's the key. What I just did is I listed off those mechanical parts that I said Goethe was trying to transcend, and he did. It's not that the parts are necessarily a bad thing. It's just he didn't start with the parts. So he watched the horse move over time, and he would just sort of sit and watch and allow it, its essence, its idea to reveal itself or to be intuited by him. And then what he would do is he would take that idea and he would check all these different parts. And he would say, is movement really the transformation here, or is it something else? And of course, he's a scientist, so he takes it seriously. He's not just doing confirmation bias. And then this is what you get, right? So the planza of the plant, or the planza, is that series of expansion and contraction that we talked about producing a leaf. The underlying formative principle of the horse is movement. Each part of the horse, each organ of the horse exists as a transformation or expression of the idea of movement, this sort of metaphysical entity. Hopefully you can see where this is going here. So essentially, connecting this to political narratives is, in my opinion, both sides, and I will both sides, as I'm always often to say, I don't mind both sidesing things so long as it corresponds to reality. But when you have one side doing 98% wrong and the other side doing 2% wrong, no, I'm not going to both sides. But in this case, I think the both sides are necessary. So in my opinion, both the political left and the political right have non-consciously attempted a sort of Goethean morphology of sorts. But instead of doing it to horse or a plant, they've done it to America. And by the way, I should make this clear. This idea of the underlying formative principle, that's been expanded to other domains. I don't have it here, but of course, Joseph Campbell, what does he call it? The mythology. That's his whole thing. The hero's journey. Every myth is more or less a different expression or transformation of this underlying formative principle, this underlying formative narrative. Separation, initiation, return. This is how the myths operate, right? This underlying formative principle. And then, of course, in history, you have someone like Oswald Spengler, and he says that each civilization has an underlying formative principle, and that's trying to express and transform that. And he says once this happens, once this is apotheosized, the civilization has essentially fulfilled its spiritual duty, and now it can be destroyed so new things can happen. So, for example, like the ancient Greeks was the body. That's the underlying formative principle that sort of fueled and charged everything. If the Western civilization in America, it's perspective. Hello, Jean Gebser's mental consciousness structure. If you want to go hear the connections to that, go watch Kill Rationalism Part 3, I believe. I think in China it was the Tao or the Way. There's some interesting stuff there. And, okay, but let's get back to this. So the left has done this, right? So viewing America starting from 1776, or probably honestly even before that, because what's her name? Hannah B. Jones, was that her name? She said that, what do they call it? The 1619 Project, which I believe was the year where the first African slave was documented to have come to the United States to start his slave work. So you can see whether you want to start at 1619 or 1776, what the left has said is they've noticed America's progression, this sort of beginning movement from the point of origin. And they believe, starting with the whole and moving to the parts, that the underlying formative principle has been revealed. And their intuition, or I don't want to say interpretation because that's mental, their intuition or realization of this principle, take a guess what you think it is. Bigotry, hatred, and racism. That is the underlying formative principle that the left believes that all of our institutions are transformations or expressions of. So in fairness to them, there's, I'm going to give props to each one of these. There is a certain degree of validity to this, right? When you have slavery, and then it transforms to Jim Crow, and then it transforms to just generally, well, I guess you always had the generally bigoted attitudes, but then let's say it transforms to redlining, and let's say it transforms into segregation. Everything I just listed is a transformation or a different expression of the underlying formative principle of anti-black racism. That's kind of undeniable. Now, that's not the whole story. They're only looking at the negative. But I don't think it's necessarily absurd to view it from that perspective. I think they have touched on something, if nothing else, that if we're going to integrate the past, we should probably integrate the negative aspects too. And I think they should be respected for that, because the right, they don't like that. They want to view, we'll get to them in a second. But it does make a certain degree of sense, right? So to the left, or at least the far left, America's underlying formative principle is hatred, bigotry, racism, all that stuff. And we know that's true because look at the institutions. They are transformations of this principle. This is why the left says, America was built on slavery. Slavery's in every institution. There's also a certain degree of pre-rational hidden causality as well, of course, the magic structure, we can tell. But, it's there is something to it. They are, like many things with the left, they are right, and many things with the right, they're also correct. They're both correct, but only from a particular perspective. So the right does this exact same thing. They view America as a whole, transforming through time, and they believe that each institution, each cultural facet, each social facet is an expression or transformation of the underlying principle of order, reason, and Christianity. There is some validity to this too. If you like the rights conferred upon you by the Constitution, or maybe by God and just sort of codified in the Constitution, wherever you want to say it comes from, you have Christianity to thank for that. The idea that you are made in God's image and therefore you are endowed with inalienable rights, that is a direct downstream line from Christianity to politics. You have that to thank for, the right to thank for that, excuse me. You also have just a general principle of rationality and reason. The libertarians, we'll get on this too. We'll get to them in a second. But all the values presupposed in the Christian ethical system, community, all these things that are important to America. And also order, too. There's a certain degree of order. There's a moral order. There's a social order. There's a political order. There's a military order. There's a spiritual order. So order, reason, and sort of everything subsumed in the giant umbrella of the Christian God and the Christianity. That is the underlying formative principle to the right. Again, just like the left, they are correct in this, but they are only partially correct. They are fragmentary, correct only in fragments. I'm not even going to try that again. So the libertarians have done this as well. And of course, their underlying formative principle that they have intuited, what do you think it is? It's order, a certain degree of order, material wealth, and more importantly, liberty or freedom. So America, obviously, at least for a time, and I still probably say now, is the most free country in the history of the world. And this led to an extreme amount of political and moral benefits. We no longer had to do this unbelievably terrible justice system where you were deemed guilty or innocent based on your belonging to a certain tribe. You were actually, I don't care if you're corrupt, or I don't care if you're elite or you're low. If you do something wrong, you are going to be put on trial for it. And I think that's a good thing. You have all this great stuff like capitalism, which is amazing, by the way. Don't get me started. All this great stuff. And you have freedom for people to actually live their life and actually express their soul in its plentitude. You can't do that if you're in a concentration camp, if you're enslaved, or you belong to just this deficient collectivism that is essentially decided before you were even born what your life purpose was going to be. I mean, who cares about your soul, right? I mean, you're just a collective. It kind of reminds me of that Cormac McCarthy line when he quotes Shakespeare. And he said that the Dauphin said, "There are some men who are not yet born who have cause to curse the world." It kind of is like that. Like you're thrown, in a Heidegger sense, into a world that's already made meaningful, right? But everything, the devil's in the details, right? So if you're thrown into a world of just pure deficient collectivism, well, your life's already set out, unfortunately. All are partially correct. All are correct from their own viewpoint, kind of like the moral, ethical systems. Utilitarians are right at times. Deontologists are right at times. Virtue ethicists are right at times. Time is that integrating factor. And I think, this is a key point, by the way. Here's the problem. So they're correct. Each side is correct in a certain sense. Here's the big problem. Well, notice what Goethe did. Goethe stopped, I don't want to say neutrally necessarily, because Heidegger says that's not possible. But what Goethe didn't do is necessarily impart a certain logic and then engage in confirmation bias, which is to say, during this process of allowing holistic entities in a state of perpetual becoming to unfold and express and reveal their underlying formative principle, it's exactly that, a revelation. So the process happens, and then it is revealed to you, which is to say, it is coming towards you. The mistake that every single one of these the left, the right, and the libertarians, the mistake they've all made is they have inverted this process. So rather than letting this be revealed to you, they start with the Christian narrative. They start with the oppressor-oppressed woke narrative. They start with the libertarian narratives, and they impose it, and then they look for fragments of history and parts of history to confirm their biases. If they were truly allowing it to be revealed to them, they would realize that every single one of them is both correct and wrong simultaneously. It is all of these perspectives and probably a little bit more. And not only that, I mean, if things are constantly in motion in accordance with time, well, then there's nothing to say that it's set in stone forever, right? That doesn't make sense at all. I don't see how it could be set in stone forever if things are constantly being revealed and the revelation is directly tied to the constant change of the people who operate and create and found the country. So that's my sort of idea of how all sides have really kind of destroyed the country through a non-conscious attempt at Goethean morphology. And I think, even if he's a little pessimistic, I'll take Spengler's conscious attempt or Goethe's attempt, that I think is a little better. Now, why is Goethe a based 4D integral irrational thinker? The reason why is because there's two big things. One, it should be obvious. Let's talk about the integral fact, actually. So notice what I said earlier about Goethe letting science inform his conceptual stuff. What he hasn't done, what he's doing is he's letting experiential knowledge, just pure observation, inform his estimate of knowledge, which gives validity to Gebser's idea that these two are polar complements, right? You can't have one without the other. One informs the other. One acts as a sort of qualitative guardrail against the other. The mistake rationalists make is viewing these as antithetical, as if as if you could do any sort of mental rational thinking without some sort of sensory input, and as if the world would be anything without the projection or actualization of our mental concepts. Like, why even bother at that point? The postmodernists did this whether they realize it or not. They seem to think that all knowledge is estimate of knowledge, and then if it's estimate of knowledge, then it's socially constructed because there's no connection to experiential knowledge. Absolutely ridiculous. It's nonsense. So that's why he's an integral thinker. He lets science and philosophy work together rather than viewing these as necessarily opposed domains. It's silly. So he's based in that sense. But he's also, of course, based in the sense that he emphasizes time. Time is obviously the key point here. I mean, it's the radical shift he makes from rendering static and spatial to putting them in motion, So that's why I think Goethe is a pretty based 4D irrational thinker. And I also think that's why Gebser praises him so much in the book. I have yet to see someone who's actually taking Goethe seriously and not, praise him to the point where it's like, are you going to suck him off in the bathroom or something? Like, what is this? It's pretty incredible how he just commands that just universal respect. It's really just impressive more than anything. So these were my thoughts. What do you guys think? What are some of these other narratives that I haven't put too much thought into this? I'm sure you could really keep going with this. So do you agree with my conclusions that the left takes a more negative approach, where the right takes a more positive approach, but both make the same mistake? What do you guys think? What do you think of Goethean morphology? Are you going to sort of, for lack of a better term, employ it on certain things? You could do it to all living organisms. Again, I mean, look at the diversity there. So we have plants, and then we have horses. These are living organisms. But then we also have things like mythology and things like history. So Goethean morphology doesn't necessarily have to have a strict biological application. It can be applied to all sorts of things. So hopefully this sort of unloosens the screws for some of you guys, and you guys can use it and improve all of our lives, because this stuff is killing us. I love you guys so much. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you soon. Love you guys.